So in this video, I'm going to go over some examples of a subtype of logically completing the text question that I will refer to as cautious inference questions. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think the examples will make it clear once we get into them. But briefly, the idea is that you'll come across these questions, maybe not on every single test, but fairly often, in which they'll talk about a phenomenon, basically a thing that people are trying to understand. For example, the behavior of wild bees. Okay, just to throw out an example. And that's the thing they're trying to understand. And then they might note in the passage that researchers have been focused on, bumblebees, for example. So a subtype of wild bee, but something that doesn't resemble every single type of wild bee. And they might say something like, well, researchers have drawn certain conclusions based on the behavior of bumblebees, but it should be noted that bumblebees differ from other wild bees in certain ways. And then they ask us to draw a conclusion. And that conclusion is basically going to be something like this. Rather than making some bold prediction or some confident assertion, the answer is going to say that basically we should be cautious about the lessons learned from studying bumblebees because those lessons might not apply to all other kinds of wild bees. Something like that. Okay, and so on these examples, we're going to see variations on that sort of theme. And this video will continue into a part 2 because there are quite a few examples to look at. So starting with this one here, it says that research on decision-making under uncertainty has often focused on individuals who regularly engage in probabilistic reasoning tasks, such as experienced traders, like financial traders, competitive poker players, and participants in laboratory-based economics experiments. As a result, much of what psychologists know about how people assess risk has been derived from these groups. In a 2021 analysis, however, this scientist notes that many members of these populations routinely receive feedback on their decisions and develop strategies for managing uncertainty over time, conditions that are not typical of most real-world decision-making contexts. He therefore suggests that blank. Okay, and so if we can recognize that we have an instance of this pattern, we're going to have a good head start when it comes to delving into the answer choices. But what I'm going to do here is just a little diagram that says something like this. All people, meaning, people in general, that's the sort of target if researchers are trying to, study decision-making under uncertainty. But the samples that they have studied have focused on subsets. I'm just going to say samples, but maybe they're groups, whatever, that are not entirely representative of people in general. And so the idea is that while they may have learned some things, those things, again, may not necessarily apply to all people. So we need to be cautious when making inferences about decision-making under uncertainty in general from this research. And so we look at answer choice A. Real-world decision-making contexts differ from laboratory settings primarily in the emotional intensity of the risks involved. And so that's making a bold sort of statement, primarily. We don't have anything to support that at all in the passage. B, individuals who lack formal training in probabilistic reasoning are more likely than experts to rely on intuitive heuristics, like guidelines, rules of thumb, when making high-stakes decisions. Well, again, that's another bold assertion that we don't have any basis for. We don't want to make a bold assertion. We want to make a cautious inference. C, experimental studies of decision-making should prioritize participants whose professional activities involve frequent exposure to uncertainty. No, they already do. I think the word should is generally a red flag. I can't recall seeing a correct answer on logically completing the text question that used the word should. Maybe it's happened, but again, that's a bold assertion, and we don't want to make one of those. So D, findings from studies of risk assessment may, that's very cautious, overstate the consistency with which people, in general, apply probabilistic reasoning outside of structured or feedback-rich environments. Yes, because most of the studies that have been done have focused on decision making in structured or feedback-rich environments, and so we want to be cautious. So that is our first example, but we're going to see plenty of other variations on this theme. And now for a second example, this one from a more sciencey or natural sciencey topic area. So much of what biologists know about the genetic regulation of development in organisms, basically, comes from studies of a small number of model organisms, particularly Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly, whose short life cycle and well-mapped genome make it well-suited to laboratory research. As a result, insights into how genes interact to shape physical traits have often been derived from experiments on fruit flies. However, this developmental biologist notes that Drosophila exhibits patterns of gene expression timing and cellular differentiation that differ markedly from those observed in many vertebrate species. She therefore cautions that blank. Okay, and this one is a little bit different in that, well, are fruit flies vertebrates? No, they're not. But the target group that we want to understand something about in this case is vertebrate species. And so the study group, the thing studied, is actually not a subset of that, but it's okay. I'm just going to put FF for fruit flies. Okay, so they've come up with insights into how genes interact from studying fruit flies, but because these fruit flies have traits or characteristics that differ from those observed in vertebrates, we want to be cautious. We don't want to just throw everything out, but we want to be cautious when making inferences from fruit flies to vertebrate species. So again, we want to avoid answers that make bold assertions and look for one that urges caution. So A, because Drosophila has been studied more exclusively than most other organisms, its role in developmental biology has limited the exploration of alternative genetic models, and that goes too far. We don't see any evidence that it has limited the exploration of other models. We just want to be cautious about drawing inferences from Drosophila. Okay, so B, conclusions about the genetic basis of development drawn from studies of Drosophila may not always apply straightforwardly to organisms with substantially different developmental processes. And that's exactly what we want. So again, we have that cautious wording, may not always apply straightforwardly. And then organisms with substantially different developmental processes, those are vertebrates. Okay, and that's exactly what we're looking for. We honestly don't even need to look at C or D, but we might as well since we're here. So vertebrate species are more likely than invertebrates to rely on environmental rather than genetic factors. Nope, that's another bold assertion. Nothing supports that. And D, future research on genetic regulation should focus primarily on organisms whose developmental timelines more closely resemble those of humans, and that's going too far. It's not that it should do this or that, it's just that based on this research that exists, should be cautious in terms of the inferences we make or the conclusions we draw. And so this is a very common sort of answer, a sort of pattern that they build into these passages.